The village of St. Hilda's had, until that morning, been quietly wrapped in the gentle rhythms of late spring. Birds called from blossoming hedgerows, and the scent of fresh hay lingered faintly in the air. The village green was alive with preparations for Lord Ashworth's annual garden party, an event that, despite its ostentation, had long been the highlight of St. Hilda's social calendar. Tea tables were arranged in delicate rows, bunting fluttered lazily from the oaks, and the silver gleamed in anticipation of polished service. Miss Jane Marple, sitting quietly on a bench beneath a flowering magnolia, observed the scene with her usual serene attentiveness. She had been visiting her old friend, Mrs. Lydia Langford, who was helping organize the event, and had been offered a small seat at the corner of the garden, a spot that afforded her the perfect vantage of both the guests and the staff. She sipped her tea and watched the flurry of activity. The butler fussing over the tablecloths, the gardeners moving with mechanical precision, and the local gentry arriving in their gleaming motor cars. It was, Miss Marple noted, exactly the sort of day that would make a village gossip happy, and, sometimes, a murder possible. The first sign of trouble arrived not with shouting or scandal, but in a subtle, uneasy silence. The chatter of the assembled guests faltered, and a ripple of tension moved through the crowd like a faint, unidentifiable tremor. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, accustomed to noticing small discrepancies in behavior, immediately caught sight of Lord Ashworth himself. The elderly gentleman, usually the embodiment of aristocratic composure, was standing near the fountain with a crumpled letter in his hand, his face pale and drawn. "Something is amiss," murmured Miss Marple to herself, as she had murmured to herself many times before when a disturbance began in earnest. Before anyone could react, Lord Ashworth spoke, his voice trembling with something between fear and indignation. My will has vanished. Who would dare?" A hush fell over the party. Ladies clutched their parasols with nervous fingers. Gentlemen murmured in concerned tones. The household staff exchanged glances of alarm. A will, of course, was a private, legal document, but it was also the key to fortunes and inheritances. The implications of its disappearance were vast and, Miss Marple knew, dangerous. Lord Ashworth's only son, Edward Ashworth, flushed crimson and demanded, "Have you searched the study, father? Surely it could not have disappeared without someone knowing." "Yes, Edward, I have searched," Lord Ashworth exclaimed, waving the now useless letter. "It is gone, utterly gone." Miss Marple, who had risen quietly and was now slowly walking toward the fountain, noted the tension in Edward's posture, the faint twitch of the corners of his mouth, and the way he avoided his father's eyes. It was subtle, but it did not escape her. The missing will, she realized, had instantly transformed a picturesque garden party into a scene charged with suspicion and unease. By the time the local constable, a stout man with a florid complexion named Inspector Grayson, arrived, called in by the increasingly panicked Lord Ashworth, Miss Marple had already formed a small mental map of potential trouble. The missing will could not have vanished on its own, and in a village like St. Hilda's, everyone had their own interest, and often their own secret, in matters of inheritance. "Please, everyone," Lord Ashworth implored, "remain calm. This is a serious matter." Miss Marple, however, was already calm. Observant as ever, she began to take note of the tiny, telling details. A mud smudge on a guest's cuff, a smirk barely concealed behind a fan, the way the maid's eyes darted toward the study door. All these were minute, almost meaningless to anyone else, but not to her. Something told Miss Marple that this was not merely a case of mislaid papers. No, this was personal, this was deliberate, and in her quiet, unassuming way, she would soon set about unraveling exactly how and why. The news of the missing will spread through St. Hilda's like wildfire, first whispered between lips over steaming teacups, and then carried through the village streets by the inevitable runners of gossip. By mid-afternoon, The village green, which had only moments before been a scene of genteel chatter and polite laughter, had taken on a different air. Faces that had smiled politely now carried faint suspicion. Murmurs followed every movement, and glances lingered with just a hint of accusation. Miss Marple, seated again on her magnolia bench, watched with quiet interest as the villagers reacted. Mrs. Langford fretted openly, wringing her hands as she confided in the local baker that it was simply unthinkable that a will could disappear without someone being responsible. The baker nodded solemnly, his expression betraying the delight that came from having such an event to discuss, while his wife, overhearing from the doorway of the shop, raised an eyebrow and wondered aloud if the household staff might be involved. In the midst of this, young Edward Ashworth moved through the gathering, attempting to reassure the guests with stiff smiles, but his gestures were too practiced, too carefully measured to mask his unease. Miss Marple observed him closely. There was something about the way he spoke with forced calm, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth when a question about the will came up that suggested nerves far more profound than mere filial concern. Meanwhile, the constable, Inspector Grayson, attempted to restore a semblance of order, urging the guests to remain calm and promising a thorough investigation. His voice carried authority, yet his manner betrayed an underlying uncertainty. He consulted briefly with the house staff, scribbling notes in his leather-bound notebook, but the villagers' speculative chatter drowned out much of his authority. Mrs. Marjorie Linton, the vicar's wife, had found a small group of ladies beneath an espaliered apple tree and was regaling them with what she considered the most probable explanation, that the will had been taken by some distant relative with a hidden claim. After all, she said, speaking with measured importance, it would not be the first time a young man, or woman, acted out of sheer greed. One must not underestimate human nature, my dear. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The truth, she thought, was seldom so obvious, and it was rarely the most vociferous who held it. The vicar's wife was certainly correct in noting the motives that might exist, yet she spoke in broad strokes, oblivious to the subtleties that lay beneath polished surfaces. By late afternoon, whispers had shifted toward insinuations, and the inevitable first suspect had emerged. Henry Pritchard, the manor's long-serving butler, known for his precise efficiency and impeccable discretion. Some villagers suggested he might have taken the will for reasons only he could fathom, while others defended him vigorously, claiming that no man so loyal would ever betray his employer. The debate swirled like the petals of the magnolia in the gentle spring breeze, but Miss Marple noted a tiny detail, a smear of ink on the cuff of his otherwise spotless sleeve, the faint scent of lavender soap that lingered near the study door, the subtle hesitation in his voice when he answered the inspector's questions. None of it was conclusive, yet as always, the pieces were forming a puzzle only she could begin to see. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, Lord Ashworth called everyone together once more, his voice shaky but determined. "We must be thorough," he said, glancing nervously toward the study, "and no one leaves until we understand what has happened to my will." Miss Marple, listening silently, understood that the stage had been set. The village had revealed its first layer of personalities, its anxieties, its petty jealousies and genuine loyalties. In this quiet observation, she discerned that the true intrigue was only just beginning, and that beneath the polite murmurs and outward calm, a more complex human drama was unfolding, one that would require patience, subtlety, and the quiet, patient weaving together of threads that only she could perceive. She rose from her bench, adjusting her gloves, and walked slowly toward the study door, her eyes tracing the movements of all present, noting each slight twitch, every flicker of the eye. The missing will was the spark, but it was the human reactions to that spark that would illuminate the path to the truth. And Miss Marple, as ever, intended to follow that path with the gentle, unassuming patience for which she was so quietly feared, and so deeply trusted. As evening approached, the manor settled into an uneasy quiet, though the air remained thick with tension. The garden party had effectively dissolved into a congregation of anxious faces, each guest whispering cautiously to their neighbors, each remark laden with suspicion, half-truths, and carefully veiled concern. The inspector busied himself with interviews, yet it was clear he was as much at sea as anyone else, chasing after statements that contradicted each other and hoping, vainly, for some definitive lead. Miss Marple moved among the guests, her presence unremarkable, her steps measured and deliberate. She listened more than she spoke, noting not only what was said, but what was left unspoken, the glances that lingered too long, the half-smiles that masked irritation or worry, the tiny gestures that betrayed impatience or fear. Even the smallest detail could reveal the most significant truths, and she had long learned that human nature rarely concealed its secrets entirely. Edward Ashworth, meanwhile, appeared increasingly uneasy. He moved from group to group, attempting to project confidence, yet Miss Marple observed the rigidity in his posture, the faint tremor in his hands when no one was watching, and the way he avoided direct eye contact with those who had been closest to his father. These were the subtle, telltale signs of a man aware of complications beyond the immediate scope of polite conversation. From the kitchen came hurried footsteps, and the housemaid, Mary Havers, appeared in the doorway, pale and flustered. "Excuse me, sir," she said, speaking to the inspector. I found this in the corner of the study." She held out a small folded piece of paper, creased and smudged as though hastily handled. Inspector Grayson took it with a practiced air, scanning it quickly, his brow furrowing. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked, his tone brisk. "Just behind the writing desk," Mary replied, glancing nervously toward the assembled guests. "It must have slipped out when someone was looking through the drawers." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly as she approached. She could see at once that the paper was not the will itself, but a brief note, written in a hand that was meticulously careful, though not entirely unfamiliar. The words were few, the meaning obscure, yet the presence of the note suggested that someone had indeed handled the will recently. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd as the inspector read aloud. "Meet me tonight by the old dovecote. All will be revealed." Gasps and whispered conjectures followed. Lord Ashworth's eyes narrowed, Edward's face paled, and the guests exchanged furtive glances, each interpreting the note through the lens of their own fears and suspicions. Miss Marple, however, was more intrigued by what was not in the note than what was. The handwriting, the choice of words, the very act of leaving such a message all suggested a deliberate attempt at misdirection. Whoever had taken the will wanted attention, but they also wanted to control the narrative, to lead others to believe in a story that masked the truth. As twilight deepened, the manor staff began to prepare a modest supper, and the guests retired indoors under various pretexts, leaving the inspector to consider his next move. Miss Marple, glancing at Edward as he lingered uncertainly near the study, realized that the young man's tension was not entirely performative. There was a weight to his anxiety that hinted at more than mere concern for his father's property. The evening passed with an uneasy rhythm, servants moving silently between rooms, guests whispering behind closed doors, and Miss Marple observing with quiet patience. Every gesture, every tone of voice, every glance carried meaning. She noted, for instance, the subtle way Mary Havers avoided the Ashworth's eyes, the faint flush on the face of the vicar's wife when the subject of inheritance came up, and the almost imperceptible way Edward's fingers fidgeted with the cuffs of his jacket whenever someone mentioned the will. By the time the manor settled into near darkness, Miss Marple had already begun to assemble the invisible threads that connected the household. She knew that the forthcoming night, with its hidden meeting at the Dovecote, would either illuminate the path to the truth or provide a clever smokescreen for deception. Either way, patience and careful observation would be required. And Miss Marple, as always, was prepared to wait. The human heart, after all, rarely kept its secrets perfectly hidden. It only required the right eyes to notice the telling signs. As the lights dimmed and the manor quieted, she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The game had begun in earnest, and she intended to follow it to its conclusion, one quiet step at a time. Night had fully settled over Ashworth Manor, the gardens swallowed by shadow, the distant hoot of an owl punctuating the otherwise still air. Inside, the household moved with subdued efficiency. Lamps were lit, the dinner table set in relative quiet, and the guests, still buzzing with unease, gathered in smaller groups, talking in hushed tones that carried more speculation than information. Miss Marple, seated by a small window overlooking the grounds, traced her fingers lightly over the embroidered arm of her chair, her mind alert. The note, she reflected, was more than a simple message. It was a provocation. Whoever had taken the will was daring someone to act, and yet, in their eagerness to mislead, they had left tiny hints in their careful orchestration, subtlety that might be invisible to anyone less observant. Edward Ashworth appeared at the drawing-room doorway, his posture rigid. "Miss Marple," he said, voice low, "you seem calm. Can one truly remain calm at such a time?" There was a tremor in his question, a nervousness thinly veiled. Miss Marple regarded him with mild curiosity, replying in her characteristic gentle tone, "One does what one can, Mr. Ashworth. Panicking rarely illuminates the truth." She watched him carefully as he stepped back, fingers flexing briefly at his sides. Even in a single exchange, she noted small tells, the quick, fleeting glance toward the study door, the hesitation before speaking. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Mary Havers and the other staff whispered urgently among themselves, careful not to let the guests overhear. There was an undercurrent of fear and loyalty intertwined. Everyone understood that a missing will was no trifling matter, and yet each held a personal stake, some financial, some reputational, some purely moral. Inspector Grayson, after reviewing Mary's note once more, announced his intention to examine the study in detail. Lord Ashworth, still pale and unsettled, agreed, and the inspector moved through the room with meticulous care, checking drawers, papers, and locked cabinets. Miss Marple lingered at the periphery, her eyes sweeping the room with quiet diligence. The study was neat, almost deliberately so, yet the faint impressions of handling on the polished surfaces and the small traces of ink smudges betrayed more than a casual glance might reveal. As the inspection continued, a small incident drew attention. A soft thump from the back of the study prompted everyone to turn, revealing Henry Pritchard, the butler, stooping to pick up a small object that had rolled beneath the desk. It was a silver seal engraved with the Ashworth crest, slightly tarnished. The inspector held it gingerly, noting its potential significance, while the assembled guests speculated in low murmurs about whether this was merely a dropped accessory or a crucial clue. Miss Marple, however, did not speak. She simply observed, noting the way Henry handled the seal. Careful, almost ritualistic, but with a subtle hesitation. It was an unconscious gesture, easily overlooked, yet telling. Later, as the guests were guided back to their rooms, Edward lingered near the study, seemingly torn between retreating and acting on some impulse. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, her attention split between him and the faint sounds that suggested other movements in the house. A door softly closing, the creak of stairs, a whisper of footsteps on the polished floors. Each sound, each gesture, added another thread to the tapestry she was quietly weaving. By the time the household settled for the night, the tension had not eased. Lord Ashworth retired to his chambers, speaking little, while Edward's restlessness was palpable even from the corridor outside. The staff, though outwardly composed, carried their own unspoken worries. And through it all, Miss Marple remained quietly observant, her mind cataloguing every small anomaly. A mud streak on a heel, a smudge of ink on a cuff, the faintest scent of tobacco, where none should be. She knew that the coming hours would be revealing. The note's instruction: "Meet me tonight by the old dovecote. All will be revealed," hung in her thoughts, a beacon of intrigue. Someone intended to move under cover of darkness, and Miss Marple, ever patient, would be ready. The human heart, she understood, rarely concealed its motives perfectly, and night often brought to light what day could not. As she settled by the window once more, the shadows of Ashworth Manor stretching long across the grounds, she felt the familiar quiet certainty that the truth, however well hidden, would soon make itself known. The hour grew late, and a silvery mist began to settle over the manor grounds, softening the sharp outlines of hedges and fountains, lending an almost ethereal quality to the night. Miss Marple, dressed in a modest shawl and hat, stepped quietly from the back door, her movements as unremarkable as the evening air itself. She carried no lantern, trusting to the pale light of the moon and the keen steadiness of her eyes, knowing that observation, not intrusion, would be her most powerful tool. The old dovecote, nestled at the far edge of the property where the garden met the untamed woods, stood in shadow, its weathered stone walls a silent witness to centuries of comings and goings. Miss Marple approached cautiously, noting footprints in the dew-laden grass. 2 sets, one small and careful, the other broader and heavier. Her mind catalogued them quietly, each step a clue to the movements of those who had arrived before her. A rustle in the undergrowth drew her attention, and she paused, allowing the sound to pass before continuing. Soon a figure emerged from the shadows. Lord Ashworth, his coat collar turned up against the chill, eyes darting nervously toward the manor. He had arrived first, evidently compelled by curiosity or some unspoken urgency, yet his posture was tense, betraying apprehension. "You are not supposed to be here," he whispered, catching sight of her silhouette. Even in darkness, Miss Marple noted the rapid rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers twisted in the folds of his coat. "I am merely observing," she replied softly, her voice calm and unhurried. "Sometimes it is the quiet ones who notice most, Mr. Ashworth." Her eyes flicked toward the dovecote's entrance, where the shadows deepened, almost as if hiding something deliberately. Edward swallowed, hesitating before moving a step forward. I received the note," he admitted, voice low. "I don't know who left it or why, but it seemed urgent." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Urgency is often the tool of those who wish to provoke action without revealing their intent. "Tell me, did you notice anything unusual this evening? Small gestures, unspoken words, anything that felt out of place?" Edward paused, brow furrowing as he recalled the day. Well, there was the seal, the silver crest found in the study, and Henry. He seemed distracted, almost careful. But I cannot say why. He shivered, whether from the cold or from unease Miss Marple could not tell. She nodded, letting the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel the weight of her words. Then, from deeper within the shadows, a faint sound emerged, a soft movement, deliberate but cautious. Another figure appeared, barely visible in the moonlight, gliding along the edge of the dovecote. Miss Marple's keen eyes immediately assessed the posture and pace. Measured, practiced, someone accustomed to moving unseen. Edward gasped quietly, instinctively stepping back. "Who?" he began. But Miss Marple's hand rose in a gentle gesture, signaling him to remain calm. The newcomer paused near the entrance, and Miss Marple noticed something that might have been dismissed by any casual observer. A faint glimmer of paper peeking from the pocket of the cloak, the slightest smudge of ink visible even from her vantage point. The will, or a fragment of it perhaps, and someone clearly intended to move it under cover of darkness. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, connecting threads she had observed over the day, the careful misdirection of the note, the nervous glances of Edward, the minor inconsistencies in Henry's behavior, and now the deliberate nighttime movements of this shadowed figure. Human nature, she thought, rarely changes, and those desperate to conceal something often reveal far more than they intend. She stepped forward, her presence calm but deliberate, and spoke, her voice carrying easily in the still night. "I believe we need to discuss what has been taken and why it matters to more than one person in this house." The figure froze, and for a moment the only sound was the whisper of the wind through the trees. Then, slowly, a hand emerged, clutching the edge of the pocket where the paper had been. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the subtle twitch in the fingers, the slight hesitation before releasing the object. In that single moment, a truth was hinted at, delicate yet undeniable. Someone in Ashworth Manor had acted carefully, purposefully, and the consequences of their action were only beginning to unfold. Edward's eyes widened, and even in the dim light, Miss Marple could detect a flicker of understanding, fear and confusion blending on his features. The game had deepened. The pieces were moving, and Miss Marple, patient and unassuming as ever, was poised to observe every nuance, knowing that the smallest detail often carried the greatest significance in uncovering human motives. The figure hesitated, a faint rustle of cloak against the grass, and then slowly stepped forward into the pale light of the moon. Miss Marple's eyes, accustomed to reading human behavior with almost surgical precision, caught the slightest tremor in the shoulders, the brief narrowing of the eyes, and the careful attempt to mask recognition. It was enough. She understood at once that she was observing someone who was both fearful and calculating, a person aware of being watched yet determined to maintain control. Edward Ashworth, standing just a few paces behind her, took an involuntary step back, his hand brushing against the cold iron latch of the dovecote door. Miss Marple's gaze flicked toward him, noting the fleeting conflict in his expression, curiosity battling apprehension, loyalty conflicted with suspicion. "Whatever you are doing here," she said softly, but with firm calm, "it would be far better to speak openly than to conceal it in the shadows. Secrets often have a habit of revealing themselves in the smallest of ways." The figure shifted uneasily, then slowly extended a hand. From beneath the cloak, a folded piece of parchment was revealed. The paper, slightly crumpled, bore the unmistakable Ashworth crest embossed in silver. Miss Marple knew at once it was a fragment of the will, though not the complete document. The act itself, though careful, betrayed both intent and anxiety. I didn't mean any harm," the figure said, voice barely audible, the words rushed and uncertain. "I only wished to ensure that nothing was taken unjustly. I thought if the will was missing, perhaps I could." The explanation faltered, leaving a jagged trail of half-reasoned thoughts. Miss Marple observed the hesitation with keen interest. It was not guilt in the sense of wrongdoing, but the nervousness of someone caught in a delicate moral and social tension, aware that discovery could invite consequences far greater than their initial intentions. Edward stepped closer, his curiosity overcoming his earlier unease. "Who are you?" he asked, voice low, almost tentative, though tinged with authority. The figure inhaled sharply, then straightened. "I am Mary Havers, sir," she said, the familiar tremor in her voice betraying both fear and a deep sense of duty. "I saw the will. I thought perhaps it was in danger of being used unfairly. I only wished to protect it until someone knew what had happened." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly in approval, though her eyes remained sharp. Mary's movements, the hesitation, the careful concealment of the parchment, each was consistent with a person acting out of principle rather than malice. Still, the fact remained that the will had vanished from its proper place, and others had clearly taken note of it. Edward's expression shifted from surprise to anger, and then softened again as he recognized Mary. "You should have come straight to my father, or the inspector," he said, voice trembling with a mixture of relief and frustration. "It was foolish, though. Understandable." Miss Marple, however, was already piecing together the next layer of the puzzle. Mary's actions, well-intentioned though they were, had been observed by someone else. Someone who had left the note instructing a nocturnal meeting by the Dovecote. The fragments of the evening were beginning to form a pattern, a chain of small acts and reactions, each carefully measured, yet revealing more than intended. She regarded Mary with her characteristic calm. "You have acted with a clear sense of responsibility," she said softly. "But the night is long, and there are those whose motives are less transparent. It would be wise to remain observant, for not all who watch are benign." Mary nodded, understanding the subtle warning in Miss Marple's tone, and stepped back, carefully placing the fragment of parchment into her cloak. Edward lingered, torn between curiosity, relief, and lingering unease, while Miss Marple's mind quietly catalogued each subtle gesture. The manner in which Mary had handled the document, the tension in Edward, the silence of the manor beyond the trees. The night air remained still, almost expectant, as if the house itself waited for the next movement, the next disclosure. Miss Marple knew that this was only the beginning of the revelations to come. The will, the motives, the carefully orchestrated acts of concealment, all were threads in a tapestry she intended to unravel with patient, unerring precision. And already, in the shadows of the Dovecote and the glimmering silver of a partially revealed document, she could sense the shape of the truth emerging, delicate and elusive, yet entirely human. Dawn crept slowly over Ashworth Manor, casting a pale, diffused light across the dew-soaked lawns. The manor, which had seemed so alive with tension the night before, now rested in a fragile, uneasy calm. Inside, the household stirred cautiously, as if everyone had been holding their breath through the night. The events by the Dovecote had left an imprint, a mixture of relief, lingering anxiety, and the knowledge that the mystery was far from resolved. Miss Marple, seated in a quiet corner of the drawing-room with a cup of tea, reflected on the previous evening. Mary Havers's confession had clarified part of the situation, but it also introduced new questions. Who had left the note? Why had it been designed to lure Edward, or anyone else, into the night? And, most pressing, where was the will now? Every action, every misstep, hinted at a deeper layer of strategy, one that required careful attention to human behavior rather than hurried assumptions. The first stirrings of the day brought the villagers back into the manor, ostensibly under the pretext of resuming normal activities. Mrs. Langford, ever eager to maintain her social position, floated through the rooms offering platitudes and suggestions, each remark a subtle probe, an attempt to discern who might be implicated. Edward Ashworth, still restless, moved between groups of servants and guests, his concern both visible and carefully moderated, while Lord Ashworth kept a measured, though visibly tense, watch over proceedings. Inspector Grayson, now joined by a colleague from the neighboring town, had begun a more systematic investigation. Drawers were examined again, documents cross-referenced, and every person in the household questioned with growing thoroughness. Yet despite their diligence, Miss Marple noted the signs that the police often overlooked. The slight hesitation before answering a question, the tiny wrinkle of the brow at a seemingly innocuous remark, the involuntary adjustment of a cuff or sleeve. These were not mistakes. They were clues. As the morning progressed, a new development emerged. While arranging books in the library, Lord Ashworth's niece, Caroline Durrant, discovered a hidden compartment in the back of a tall cabinet. Within it lay several papers, carefully folded, though none were the original will. Among them was a draft marked with corrections in a familiar hand and a note indicating that the will had been recently revised. Caroline's discovery sent a ripple through the household, stirring excitement, curiosity, and unease in equal measure. Miss Marple approached the compartment quietly, allowing herself a brief inspection. The papers were genuine, yes, but they told only part of the story. The revisions indicated that someone within the family, or at least someone with intimate knowledge of the Ashworth estate, had a precise understanding of the original will's contents and had acted with awareness of its value. Edward, noticing Miss Marple's interest, moved closer, his face taut. "Aunt Caroline found these in the library," he said, his voice betraying both hope and tension. "Could they be related to the disappearance?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, her fingers tracing the faint indentation of the writing. "But they are only fragments. The full story, the final version, remains elsewhere, and those fragments, while informative, may have been left deliberately to mislead." The rest of the morning was a careful dance of observation and subtle inquiry. Miss Marple engaged in quiet conversation with the household staff, noting their phrasing, the order in which they recounted events, and the way each individual related to Edward and Lord Ashworth. Patterns emerged, loyalties, rivalries, unspoken fears, and tiny moments of guilt or concealment that hinted at far more than the visible tension. By midday, the sense of anticipation was palpable. Even the manor itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that the missing will was not merely a document, but a fulcrum on which human motives teetered. Miss Marple, serene in her composure, understood that the coming hours would likely bring the next critical revelation. The threads she had been quietly weaving, Mary's actions, Edward's reactions, Caroline's discovery, Henry's careful manner, were all converging, and it was only a matter of time before one slip, one overlooked detail, or one moment of human weakness would illuminate the path to the truth. And Miss Marple, as ever, was ready to follow it, patiently and deliberately, knowing that the solution depended not on haste, but on the quiet, unerring observation of human nature at its most revealing. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere within Ashworth Manor had grown taut, the previous night's shadows lingering despite the bright sunlight filtering through tall sash windows. The household moved with measured care, each footstep and whispered conversation carrying a subtle tension, as though the walls themselves were aware that the missing will had stirred something deeper than mere curiosity. Miss Marple, seated near the hearth with her knitting, allowed her eyes to drift over the assembly of people in the drawing-room. Edward Ashworth, now pacing slowly, seemed torn between impatience and anxiety, his gaze occasionally flicking toward the library where Caroline had found the draft papers. The inspector had begun questioning the household in earnest, his notebook filling with statements that were precise but often incomplete, as though the speakers themselves were carefully managing the information they revealed. It was in these moments, when everyone assumed they were being discreet, that Miss Marple saw what others missed. A glance exchanged between two maids, a faint flush on Mrs. Langford's cheek as she tried to appear indifferent, a subtle clenching of the jaw by Henry Pritchard. All these were threads she quietly wove into her growing understanding of the evening's events. A sudden knock at the library door drew her attention. Caroline Durrant appeared, her expression a mixture of excitement and unease. "Miss Marple, you must see this," she said softly, her voice carrying the urgency of discovery. She gestured toward the papers laid out on the desk. There, beneath the pile of drafts and notes, was a small envelope, sealed and addressed in Edward Ashworth's hand. Miss Marple approached, noting the deliberate care with which the envelope had been hidden. She lifted it gently, feeling the weight of its contents. "And what do we have here?" she murmured, mostly to herself. The envelope contained a letter, a copy of a recent amendment to the will, though its wording suggested that it was not the final legal version. Someone, she realized, had attempted to manipulate perception, leaving hints of truth while obscuring the full picture. Edward's expression darkened as he saw her examining the papers. I don't understand," he admitted. "Could someone have been trying to frame me, or worse, to take the inheritance before it was proper?" Miss Marple's eyes softened but remained focused. "It is seldom as simple as it appears, Mr. Ashworth. The document itself is a lure. The true motives lie not in the papers, but in the human heart. Observe carefully the smallest actions, for they will betray what is concealed more effectively than any statement or note." At that moment, Henry Pritchard entered, bearing a tray of refreshments, his posture precise, controlled, but with a tension Miss Marple had long learned to recognize. His hands trembled imperceptibly as he placed the tray on the table, and the faint scent of lavender soap seemed more pronounced, an unconscious attempt at reassurance or disguise. Miss Marple noted the timing. He had arrived just after the envelope was discovered. Too coincidental, perhaps, though there was nothing overt to accuse him of wrongdoing. The afternoon passed with a careful rhythm of observation. Miss Marple engaged in polite conversation, allowing the others to speak freely while she quietly catalogued their reactions. Caroline's curiosity tinged with fear, Edward's controlled panic, Mary Havers's subtle anxiety as she moved about performing small tasks, and Henry's disciplined yet taut demeanor. Each individual revealed, in small, seemingly inconsequential ways, the contours of their character and the possible motivations that had guided the night's events. As shadows lengthened toward early evening, Miss Marple found a quiet moment to step into the garden. The dovecote, visible at the far edge of the lawns, seemed even more mysterious in the fading light, its dark stone walls a silent reminder of last night's secretive meeting. She allowed herself a small smile. The human heart, she reflected, is rarely so disciplined as to conceal all impulses. Fear, greed, loyalty, and pride inevitably leave marks, however subtle. The missing will had stirred these forces, and in the unfolding tension, Miss Marple could already perceive the faint outlines of the truth waiting for the right moment to fully reveal itself. And she knew that moment would arrive not through hurried action or obvious confrontation, but through the quiet unveiling of human nature, through slips, hesitations, and the small, telling details that revealed who had acted and why. The evening promised revelations, and Miss Marple, ever patient, would be ready to observe them all. As twilight deepened over Ashworth Manor, the household settled into an uneasy stillness. The afternoon's discoveries, the hidden drafts, the envelope in Edward's hand, and the subtle reactions of the staff had set the stage for a night that promised revelation, though the form it would take remained uncertain. Miss Marple, quietly observing from the drawing-room window, noted the long shadows stretching across the lawn and the faint rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Edward paced near the library door, his unease now mingled with a flicker of determination. He was aware, perhaps instinctively, that the situation was far more complicated than a simple misplacement of papers. Each interaction of the day had hinted at layers of intention, concealed motives, and small, deliberate acts designed to mislead. He was not alone in sensing this. Miss Marple had watched the household staff adjust their movements, their minor hesitations, betraying a web of subtle anxieties. It was then that Mary Havers, moving cautiously as if guided by an invisible compass, approached the drawing-room. In her hand, she carried the fragment of parchment she had revealed the night before, still carefully folded. Her face bore the pale tension of someone who had carried a secret too long. Yet her movements were measured, disciplined, an unconscious reflection of both fear and duty. Miss Marple rose and spoke softly, allowing the words to carry their weight without alarm. "Mary, it is clear that the night's events were observed by more than one set of eyes. There are those who act with deliberate intention and others who merely respond. It is in those responses that we see truth. Mary hesitated, then nodded, placing the parchment on the table before them. I tried to protect it, Miss Marple. I thought that if I kept it hidden, no one could use it wrongly, but I fear someone may already have had other plans. Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward the library, then toward Henry Pritchard, who moved about silently, arranging papers and straightening the room with an almost ritualistic precision. His calm exterior, she noted, was not deception in itself, but a layer of discipline carefully maintained to conceal subtle discomfort. She observed the small smudge of ink on his cuff, the faint scent of soap stronger than usual, the precise timing of each movement, all the quiet tells of a man accustomed to discretion, but now caught within a web of circumstances beyond his control. Edward, standing close, finally broke the silence. If the will was hidden or taken, it could mean— He faltered, uncertain how much to voice, but Miss Marple's patient, attentive presence encouraged him to continue. It could mean that someone is deliberately manipulating events, ensuring that the inheritance, and perhaps our reputations, are guided by their hand, not father's intent. Miss Marple nodded slightly, her expression serene but her mind sharp. Indeed. But manipulation, in such a carefully observed household, always leaves traces. We see them in hesitations, in inadvertent glances, in the small, nearly imperceptible marks left behind when someone acts in secret. She paused, her eyes sweeping the room, noting each subtle expression, each minor gesture that might otherwise be dismissed. At that moment, a soft tap echoed from the doorway, drawing attention to Caroline Durrant, who appeared hesitant yet determined. She held another document, this one seemingly mundane but with a faint impression of handwriting beneath the folded creases. Miss Marple leaned closer, recognizing immediately the significance. Another fragment, another layer in the unfolding story, and one that might connect the previous discoveries with the true sequence of actions regarding the will. The evening drew on, each revelation layering upon the last. The household, once seemingly tranquil, had become a careful theater of observation and concealed truth. Miss Marple, quiet and unassuming, catalogued every nuance. The weight of responsibility in Edward's stance, the nervous vigilance in Mary's movements, the disciplined restraint in Henry's demeanor, the measured curiosity in Caroline's eyes. She understood, with the calm certainty that only decades of human observation could yield, that the final disclosure was near. The missing will was no longer merely a document. It was a mirror reflecting the desires, fears, and intentions of all those involved. And in the subtleties of human behavior, in the pauses, the gestures, the almost invisible signs, Miss Marple already sensed the outline of the truth, ready to emerge when the carefully orchestrated moments aligned with the inevitability of human nature. Night had fallen again over Ashworth Manor, but this time the darkness felt different, charged with a quiet tension, as if the house itself anticipated the coming revelation. Miss Marple, sitting in her usual unassuming corner of the drawing-room, felt the familiar thrill of observation sharpen her senses. Every gesture, every glance, every subtle adjustment of posture in the household told a story, and she had spent the day weaving these tiny threads into a coherent picture. Edward Ashworth, restless and uneasy, paced near the fireplace, occasionally glancing toward the library where Caroline Durrant had placed the newly discovered fragments. The young man's movements were careful, but not controlled. His hand trembled slightly when he clasped it behind his back, a detail Miss Marple noticed and catalogued. He was anxious, yes, but not deceitful. His concern was genuine, even if his instincts were to act before fully understanding the situation. Mary Havers moved silently about, clearing a small tray of tea and biscuits, but her nervous glances betrayed her. She had acted with pure intent in safeguarding the partial will, yet she could not conceal the tension that lingered after last night's clandestine rendezvous. Miss Marple noted the subtle relief in her eyes whenever Edward or Caroline approached her, the way her fingers lingered on objects as if seeking reassurance. Henry Pritchard, the butler, remained composed yet slightly rigid. Each movement, each careful adjustment of a tablecloth or repositioning of a chair was executed with precision, but the faint ink smudge on his cuff and the measured timing of his actions hinted at a man acutely aware of being observed. Miss Marple had long learned to see such small tells, recognizing that outward calm often concealed a mind working quietly through worry or guilt. "Shall we assemble the household?" Miss Marple suggested softly, her voice carrying just enough weight to command attention without alarm. "It seems the evening is ripe for clarity, and clarity is best achieved together." Lord Ashworth, pale but composed, nodded, motioning for everyone to gather. The guests and household staff congregated in the drawing-room, each person acutely aware of the tension in the air. Miss Marple's eyes swept across the assembly, noting the subtle interplay of glances and body language, the brief flicker of recognition, the momentary tightening of a jaw, the micro-expressions that betrayed inner thoughts. "Let us consider the events of the past day calmly," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle yet firm. "A will has gone missing, fragments have been discovered, and several individuals have acted in ways that reveal both intention and concern. In understanding human nature, we often find that actions speak more clearly than words." Her gaze settled on Henry Pritchard, who stood rigidly near the fireplace. "Mr. Pritchard," she said, her voice soft but precise, "you are a man accustomed to discretion and loyalty. Yet last night your actions suggested more than simple obedience. You handled the will or its fragments in a manner designed to conceal and to control. Tell me, what prompted this careful management?" Henry's composure faltered slightly. His lips pressed together, and he glanced momentarily toward Edward before returning his gaze to Miss Marple. I saw an opportunity," he admitted slowly, "to ensure that the will remained intact and that no one could take advantage of my master's absent-mindedness. I did not act out of greed, but I feared mischief might otherwise prevail." Miss Marple inclined her head, acknowledging the truth in his words, then turned her attention to Edward. "And you, Mr. Ashworth, reacted with concern, but not guile. Your anxiety was for the welfare of your father's estate, not for personal advantage, though fear may have clouded judgment." Finally, her gaze swept to Mary Havers and Caroline Durrant, who had both played subtle roles in safeguarding fragments of the document. "Each of you acted according to conscience and circumstance, yet there remains one critical detail, the note left by an unseen hand directing a meeting by the Dovecote. This was intended to manipulate, to provoke, and to observe reactions. And the hand that wrote it belonged to one who wished to guide events quietly, steering others into positions of apparent culpability while remaining unnoticed." A hush fell over the room, tension coiling like a spring. Miss Marple's voice softened but remained clear. The true orchestrator was not the one acting in visible secrecy, nor the one driven by anxiety. It was the individual who understood human nature well enough to anticipate behavior, to manipulate perception without ever exposing themselves directly. All eyes turned slowly toward Caroline Durrant, whose hands trembled slightly as she clutched the fragments she had discovered. Miss Marple's gaze met hers gently. "Caroline, you left the drafts in the library, did you not? And yet the final act, the deliberate misplacement, the careful timing, the note, was orchestrated with subtle intent. Your role has been to guide events, to watch reactions, and to ensure that the true disposition of the estate remained under controlled observation." Caroline's lips parted, then pressed together. The color drained from her face, and she lowered her gaze. I wanted to protect my uncle's wishes," she whispered. "I feared Edward might be influenced, or that others might take advantage. I only wanted to make sure the outcome was right." Miss Marple's expression softened. And in doing so, you have revealed the most human of truths, that even in the smallest acts, the desire to control can guide intentions as much as conscience. The will was never truly lost. It was merely concealed to reveal character, not theft. And now, with all threads visible, we see not malice but the careful orchestration of protective instinct. The room exhaled collectively. Relief mingled with the quiet weight of understanding. Edward's tension eased, Henry's composure returned, and Mary's shoulders relaxed. Lord Ashworth, though still pale, smiled faintly, realizing that the integrity of his estate had been preserved, and that the true lesson lay not in the document itself, but in the human nature it had revealed. Miss Marple, serene and quietly triumphant, allowed herself a faint smile. Human behavior, she reflected, was the most intricate puzzle of all, and one that, with patience, observation, and understanding, always yielded its truths. The relief in the drawing-room was palpable, yet Miss Marple knew that human nature rarely settles so completely. Even with the immediate tension diffused, subtle currents of anxiety and curiosity persisted. Guests and staff alike exchanged furtive glances, as though each was still weighing their actions and intentions against the quiet scrutiny of the others. The manor, once a stage for whispered suspicion and anxious conjecture, had shifted toward a more reflective atmosphere, though a delicate unease lingered beneath the polite smiles. Edward Ashworth, now seated near the fire with a slightly unsteady calm, glanced toward his father. Lord Ashworth, pale but resolute, observed his family and staff with an expression of cautious satisfaction. "I see now that my intentions, and indeed my trust in those around me, have been vindicated," he said softly, his voice steady. "Yet I must admit, the past day has revealed more about the people in this house than I ever anticipated." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "Indeed, Lord Ashworth, the missing will and the subtle manipulations surrounding it have revealed not merely intent but character. It is often in small, seemingly insignificant acts that the true measure of a person is found." Mary Havers, standing quietly at the edge of the room, seemed relieved, yet still uncertain. Miss Marple's gaze rested on her for a moment, appreciating the young woman's loyalty and care. "Your actions were guided by conscience, Mary, and that is always visible to those who watch carefully. There is nothing to fear when intention aligns with integrity." Henry Pritchard, still composed, yet now visibly more relaxed, offered a small nod toward Miss Marple. His meticulous attention to duty, though it had initially seemed rigid, had been instrumental in maintaining order and preventing missteps. Miss Marple allowed herself a slight smile. Even in apparent subservience, awareness and discernment could wield subtle power. Caroline Durrant, still holding the folded drafts she had discovered, met Miss Marple's calm eyes. "I only wish to protect my uncle's wishes," she murmured, a faint tremor in her voice. "I never meant to cause alarm or suspicion." "Nor did you, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "What you intended was the safeguarding of principle, not personal gain. And in that intention, truth has been illuminated and misdirection corrected. The true disposition of the estate and the actions of those entrusted are now clear to all who have observed carefully." A quiet murmur of understanding rippled through the room. The inspector, who had been taking notes with professional diligence throughout the day, allowed himself a small exhalation. "It seems, Miss Marple," he said, voice tinged with admiration, "that the solution lay not in the evidence we can touch or measure, but in observing human behavior, the subtle tells, the gestures, the reactions. I dare say without your guidance, much of this would have remained unclear." Miss Marple inclined her head with gentle humility. "Observation and patience, Inspector, reveal far more than haste or assumption. The human heart is rarely so disciplined as to conceal all impulses, and those impulses often illuminate what the mind tries to disguise." As evening deepened, the manor settled into a quiet rhythm. Conversations resumed with cautious cheer. Laughter was more tentative than before, yet there was a sense of restored order. The household had survived the ordeal not simply because of the documents or fragments of a will, but because careful attention to human nature had allowed understanding to prevail over speculation and fear. Miss Marple, seated once more near the fire with a cup of tea in hand, reflected quietly. The day had been a lesson in subtlety, in the small revealing acts of human behavior, and in the delicate balance between secrecy and disclosure. The missing will had sparked curiosity, concern, and even tension, yet it had also revealed the depth of loyalty, conscience, and character among the Ashworth household. She allowed herself a faint smile, her knitting resting idle in her lap. Human nature, she mused, always provides its own clues. It only requires the patience and attention to discern them. And for now, Ashworth Manor could rest, restored not merely in its order, but in the clarity and understanding that such careful observation brings. The following morning dawned crisp and clear over Ashworth Manor, a delicate sunlight spilling through tall windows and warming the polished floors. The manor, once heavy with uncertainty and tension, now carried a quieter, reflective air. Guests moved with measured ease, the previous day's revelations settling into an unspoken understanding, while the staff performed their duties with the calm assurance that the immediate crisis had passed. Miss Marple sat quietly near the window, her hands folded around a warm cup of tea. The events of the preceding days, Mary Havers's protective instincts, Edward's anxious vigilance, Caroline's careful orchestration, and even Henry Pritchard's disciplined interventions, had each contributed to a delicate web of human behavior. It was a web that, observed carefully, revealed truth in its smallest threads. Edward approached her, his expression softened by relief and tempered by lingering concern. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I cannot thank you enough. Without your guidance, perhaps we would never have understood what had truly occurred." Miss Marple inclined her head, her calm demeanor reflecting both satisfaction and subtle amusement. "It is rarely a matter of understanding alone, Mr. Ashworth. One must watch, listen, and wait. Human nature, left unchecked, will often reveal the truth even when one tries to conceal it." Edward glanced around the room, noting the subdued but attentive faces of the household staff. And yet, there is something remarkable in what they did. Their loyalty, their caution, it all seemed to work toward preserving my father's wishes. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Indeed, loyalty and conscience, when exercised with care, can shape events as profoundly as any overt action, and sometimes the quietest measures carry the greatest weight. Caroline Durrant entered the room, placing the folded drafts carefully on the table. She looked at Miss Marple with a mixture of relief and lingering apprehension. "I only wanted to protect Father's intentions," she said softly. "I did not expect it would become such a matter of suspense." "You acted wisely," Miss Marple replied gently. "But always remember, even the best-intentioned actions can create ripples. The important thing is that truth and integrity prevailed. And now, thanks to your careful observance, we understand not only the will but the character of those involved." Mary Havers, standing quietly nearby, offered a tentative smile. The tension that had gripped her the previous night noticeably eased. Henry Pritchard's posture, no longer so rigid, conveyed quiet relief. Each member of the household had played a part, consciously or otherwise, in revealing the subtle truth that had guided the fate of the Ashworth estate. Lord Ashworth, now fully aware of the orchestrations and intentions surrounding his missing will, spoke with measured warmth. "I see at last that the estate, and those entrusted with its care, reflects not merely property, but the integrity of character. I am grateful for the careful discernment that has preserved both." Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. knitting needles resting idly in her lap. The mystery had been resolved, not through confrontation or coercion, but through the careful observation of human behavior, the patient attention to small details, and the understanding that motives, however hidden, invariably reveal themselves in subtle, telling ways. As the household resumed its routines with a renewed sense of calm, Miss Marple glanced once more toward the garden and the old dovecote, now bathed in morning light. The events of the past days had unfolded with all the drama and intrigue of human nature laid bare, yet in the end, order and understanding had returned. The missing will had been more than a document. It had been a mirror reflecting fears, loyalties, anxieties, and intentions. And in the quiet satisfaction of a mystery resolved, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring truth she had long known, that patience, observation, and an unerring understanding of human character are the surest guides through even the most intricate of puzzles. Ashworth Manor, restored in calm and clarity, stood as testament not only to the resolution of a legal matter, but to the quiet, unassuming power of discernment and insight, a power Miss Marple wielded with gentle but absolute certainty. The household, now at peace, moved forward, each person quietly carrying the lessons learned, and Miss Marple, ever serene, allowed herself the faintest smile, knowing that human nature, observed with care, always tells the story in the end.